Dr. Barbara Fischer came from the University of Vienna, and she's working in the Department of Evolutionary Biology. So she's a biologist and data scientist with a background in mathematics and theoretical biology. Her research is focused on the evolution of birds in humans, and she also likes teaching and communicating science. So this is the right place for her talk, I think. And Barbara will discuss the relationship of Franz Unger and Christian Doppler, key persons and teachers who influenced the Mendel's life and work. Franz Unger was his professor of botany, and Christian Doppler, famous name, was a very important physicist, and he learned Mendel physics, mathematics, and also combinatorics, and this knowledge really helped him then to formulate the laws of genetics. So please, Barbara, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I actually choose to stand down here if this works for the audience, because I need to see my own slides. Otherwise, I will get stuck inevitably. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be here today and to be able to talk about Mendel and the Vienna influences on him and his scientific development. And I will focus on Doppler and Unger. We've already seen the gentleman on the right here earlier today in Greg Reddick's talk. That's Franz Unger. In the middle, you see Christian Doppler, and then there's, of course, Gregor Mendel. So Mendel was actually trying to become certified as a teacher, and he did that tried to do that at the University of Vienna. So he took an exam, and unfortunately he failed that first attempt. But then, as a consequence, he was sent to the University of Vienna by Knapp, who we've already heard a lot about earlier today. And he studied at the University of Vienna for 2 years, for 4 semesters. And this is a period that became very influential for him as a scientist, is what I want to concentrate on in my talk. But before I actually talk about what Mendel got exposed to, which kind of ideas these were he got exposed to at the University of Vienna, I want to take you back to Vienna in the 19th century. I want to talk a little bit about the city and what it was like in the 19th century. Here you see an image depicting the flooding of the Viennese suburbs, Leopoldstadt and Rossau. So here on the left, you see the inner city. You still see the city fortifications in place here. Those were demolished later by the Emperor Franz Joseph, but here they are still in place, and they were in place when Mendel lived and studied in Vienna. And here on the right, you see the Danube that is flooding the suburbs and the population, basically fighting against those damages. Those floodings were relatively regular events. This one here happened in March 1850, so the same year when Mendel actually got to Vienna. He got there in autumn to start his studies. And these floodings were pretty important events for the population, because the freshwater supply was dependent on wells back in the day. So the Viennese people got their drinking water from wells, and floodings meant that the water got dirty. And there were regular epidemics of typhoid and cholera as a consequence of these floodings. So epidemics were something not just we are facing these days, but they were something that were events that were very hard on the Viennese population. The cholera epidemics, for example, altogether cost about 18,000 lives in Vienna, until finally there was a canal system established that eradicated these events. The wells, those were basically, they supplied the fresh water for the population for a long time until a water pipe system was put in place also towards the end of the 19th century under the Emperor Franz Joseph. And that, in combination with the resilient canals, got rid of those epidemics of cholera and typhoid. But those were not the only diseases that the population had to deal with. There was, of course, also tuberculosis, for example, a disease, as we will later hear, killed Christian Doppler, the physicist, at the age of only 50 years. So to get a better impression of the city, this is a nice image here, but I'm a little bit sorry when one cannot show photographs. So I actually decided to show some photographs nevertheless of the late 19th century, so that you get a better impression of the city life, what Vienna was actually like as a city when Mendel moved there. So this is the Franz Josef's Quay in Vienna. The situation that is depicted here is actually almost the same as on this previous picture. We're seeing the same hills in the background, we're seeing the inner city on the left, but now the city fortifications are gone. This happened in the 1860s, that the Vienna Ringstraße was built and that the fortifications were removed. But again, over here on the right, you see the suburbs of Leopoldstadt, and those very interesting means of public transport here are horse trams. Those were the first means of public transport in Vienna. This is the Naschmarkt, a central market in Vienna. You see market scenes here, again the horse trams, and at the very back here there is the Stephansdom, the Dome of Saint Stephen. This is the Prater in Vienna. You see a lady walking with an umbrella, the horse carriages on the road, and then there's the giant Ferris wheel, the famous site in Vienna. This is a scene from Am Hof, also in the center of the city in Vienna, and those buildings, they look basically the same. If you go to the square Am Hof today, you see here on the left side is the central fire station in Vienna that is now housed in these buildings here on the left. So you get an impression of what the city looked like when Mendel moved there, when Mendel got there as a student in the 19th century, 1950. Vienna was a city of enormous population growth back then. So in 1800, Vienna had only 230,000 inhabitants, but then 100 years later, in 1910, it had around 2 million inhabitants. That's the size that Vienna has now. So there was an enormous population growth. Largely, this was because of migration to the city. Towards the end of the 19th century, also as a consequence of high birth rates. Birth rates were high throughout the 19th century, but they were accompanied by very high neonatal and child mortality. So this didn't really cause a growth of the overall population. In fact, the situation for children was very, very difficult for, well, at least half of them, the ones of the working class and of the poorer population. There were very many unwed mothers, and Vienna had an institution that was this, called the Findlingsheim, or Foundlings House, in the 19th century, where children of mothers who couldn't take care of the babies could be taken to be cared for, but well, without breastfeeding, without the care of the mothers, many of them died. And it's shocking how high these numbers actually were. So about a third of all children born in Vienna in 1850, the year when Mendel got to Vienna, were handed over to the Findlingsheim. A third of all children born, and of these 80% died. So imagine those incredible numbers. It was a very hard life for a large part of the population. So Vienna of the 19th century was a city of very, very large contrasts. On one hand, there was the aristocracy and the upper middle class who had a life in prosperity. but for a large part of the population, life was an everyday struggle for survival, basically. But at the same time, Vienna was a city of art and music already in the 19th century, and to illustrate that, here's a famous painting of Franz Schubert by the piano, an evening with Schubert in a house of a Viennese citizen, where famous Schubert was playing his music. So this the culture flourished nevertheless, despite the fact that the circumstances for the large majority of the population were so very difficult. And then Mendel came to Vienna as a student, and here I'm showing you the list of courses for his third semester. So this is actually the sheet of his inscription sheet for the third semester. So it lists all of the courses that he took. And up here there is some biographical information. So he's giving his name, Gregor Mendel, also his place of birth and the name of his father and so on. But down here is listing the courses, and he's listing the Semesterwochenstunden, so the number of hours per week of these respective courses, and he's listing the teachers he took those courses with. And here are my translations. So he took, as we all know, he took a course with Dr. Doppler in experimental physics. The course was actually called Demonstration in Experimental Physics, and this is what it was. It was very practical. The students were exposed to experiments, and then they were to conduct experiments and research projects themselves. He then took a zoology class with Dr. Knea. That's quite remarkable, because Knea was actually the zoologist who failed him harshly when he tried to get his teacher certification. He had some very harsh comments for Mendel, and nevertheless, Mendel went back to study zoology. Then he studied chemistry with Rettenbacher. He studied maths, application of logarithmic and trigonometric tables with Moth. And then he studied botany with Unger. He studied anatomy and physiology of plants, and also he had a practical course in how to use the microscope with Unger. So those were only the courses he took in his third semester, which was very cramped, as you can see. Apparently there was even an overlap, I think, between zoology and physics. That's not documented what he chose to avoid this overlap. He might have gone for physics because of the previous experiences with Knea, but we will probably never know. And here I'm showing you an old city map of Vienna from the time when Mendel studied there. And I've indicated the different places where Mendel actually took his courses, took his lectures with those colorful dots, and I will actually walk you through them one by one. But first I want to point out, here you see this area around the inner city, which was actually not covered, there were no buildings there yet. This was a green area called the Glacis, and it was a recreational area, but also used for agriculture in the 19th century, until the Ringstraße was built here, encircling the inner city. Also, the city fortifications are still in place here. This is actually a beautiful map, accessible online by Mörschner from the Woldern collection from the Austrian Academy of Science. So let's zoom in a little bit. These are the places where Mendel studied and lived, and first and foremost, he lived here where there is this pink dot. He lived in the 3rd district of Landstraße, namely in the convent of the Sisters of Elizabeth, in the Elisabethinenkloster in the 3rd district. He hadn't acquired this accommodation yet when he left for Vienna, so apparently he just went there and then knocked at the door and was successful in being taken in. So he found himself accommodation there, and already back then, that's actually quite remarkable, the Elisabethinenkloster was housed a hospital for women in Vienna. And if you walk down Landstraße, Hauptstraße, it looks pretty much the same now. maybe slightly different. The street looks different, but the building remains in its location where it used to be. And so this is where Mendel lived here, where there's this pink dot. And then, of course, as we've already heard, he studied physics with Doppler. And the new Institute of Physics was actually founded here, where there's this red dot, just around the corner, just a few minutes walk from his residency in Erdberger Straße. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and so for the Institute of Physics, I do not have an image because that doesn't exist anymore. The Institute of Physics later moved to Strudelhofgasse, to the inner city, and the building was actually a building that was rented by the university to house this first Institute of Physics in Vienna, and the building has been removed. Something else has been built in this very location. But this was the first Institute of Physics of the university, first Institute of Experimental Physics of the University of Vienna, and Doppler was its new director. Doppler was actually appointed director there, and the same year that he was appointed, Mendel started to study there as a student. Interestingly, as an extraordinary student, but still he was right there with the beginning of physics at the University of Vienna. He also studied geology. That was actually located in this yellow dot here. This is where the Royal Imperial Institute of Geology was located, the K&K Geologisches Institut, and this was located in this beautiful palais, in the Palais Razumovsky, which is now privately owned, but it's also still, if you take a walking tour around Vienna, you can actually look at this building. What's still missing now? Yeah, down here, these are the botanical gardens in Vienna, and this was the Botanical Museum, where Mendel did his microscopy courses with Unger, and this is what it looked like, the Botanical Museum. And here's another picture of the botanical garden with its greenhouses from these times. Now there's one more dot, which is down here. This is actually the Theresianum in the 4th district of Vienna, where Mendel studied chemistry with Rettenbach and also maths. Now, oh, and I forgot one, the light blue one here in the center. This is the old university building, which is now the Academy of Sciences in the 1st district. It looked like that, and it actually played a big role in the revolutions of 1848. So this was just 2 years before Mendel got to Vienna. The city of Vienna experienced uprisals, experienced this movement of revolutions that many European countries actually experienced. Is where the students basically and citizens demanding democratic rights. They demanded a constitution, and they demanded an end of censorship, and also educational reforms. And as it turns out, the revolutions were largely beat down by the Habsburg Empire and remained without major consequences. But there were some things that actually were realized following these revolutions, and one of them, which actually ended up to be very substantial for Mendel, was the educational reform that took place. There was a university reform put in place by a very liberally minded minister of education. His name was Thun Hohenstein, and he wanted to reform the universities. He was very determined, and he really did that. He ended the censorship at the universities, the censorship for professors' writings, also for their teaching. He ended restrictions for the content of textbooks, content of lectures, and scientific seminars were introduced in scientific institutes so that the students actually became part of the research community. So the university reform wanted to involve the students in research rather than just having them sit in lectures and listen. There is this famous quotation, the die Forschung und ihre Lehre sind frei, so the research and teaching are free. This was what the students demanded, and this was actually what was actually realized in this university reform. And as part of this university reform, Thun Hohenstein himself hired a number of high-profile professors. He actually did this in person, and the emperor had to sign off on each single one of them. So it was actually the emperor Franz Josef who hired Doppler in the end. And among those professors who he chose were both Franz Unger and also Christian Doppler, who I will talk about in a few minutes. So here are some of Mendel's professors in Vienna. These are the members of the Division of Mathematics and Natural Sciences of the Naturwissenschaftliche und Mathematische Klasse of the Austrian Academy of Sciences from 1853. You basically see all of the people all of the names who appeared on the list of courses he took. Doppler is missing here because Doppler was very sick already and died in 1853. He had to resign from his position, and he handed over his directorate to Andreas Ritter von Ettingshausen, who is sitting over here. So let's have a look at them closely. Here is Franz Unger, who's appeared more than once already today, the botanist who was an influential teacher of Mendel. Here we have Eduard Fenzel, who was the director of the Botanical Museum. Here's Josef Rettenbacher, the chemist. This is Karl Ludwig von Littrow, who was an astronomer. This is Anton Schröter von Christelli, who was a physicist, and this is Andreas von Ettingshausen, who was also a physicist and who followed Doppler as a head of the Institute of Physics after Doppler stepped down from his position. Ettingshausen was a mathematician and physicist, and he wrote a book about combinatorics, which and Mendel took a course in higher mathematics with Ettingshausen, so he probably was exposed to these ideas, and combinatorics, of course, and statistical analysis played an essential role in his famous paper. So I think, despite the fact that Unger and Doppler will be featured further in what comes next, I want to point out that some other people like Ettingshausen probably also had an influence on Mendel in his developing his own scientific ideas, approaching his own scientific questions. So this is Christian Doppler. I found one photograph. There's, of course, lots of paintings and etchings and drawings of him, but I found one photograph. Doppler was made the head of this new Institute of Physics that was founded in 1850, initiated by the minister Thun Hohenstein, and he was appointed as his director and also full professor at the University of Vienna. But then only 2 years later, he already had to hand over his directorship to Andreas von Ettingshausen, and his physics institute was located in the suburbs in Erdberg. That's quite interesting for me because I am part of the Department of Evolutionary Biology, and we actually just moved into a new building which is located in Erdberg, so this is where everything, where the circle closes itself. Doppler was a physicist and a mathematician. He was born in Salzburg, and he studied physics and mathematics at the Polytechnical Institute of Vienna. This is what's now called the Technische Universität Wien, so the Technical University. He also studied philosophy in Salzburg, and then he already considered emigrating to America because he found no suitable position anywhere. But then finally he was offered a teaching post in a secondary school in Prague, which he took on. And subsequently, he became professor at Charles University in Prague. And this is also when he published his famous work on the Doppler effect, which he is so particularly well known for. Then a few years later, he took up a professorship in Chemnitz, that's in Slovakia, but only a year later he had to move back to Vienna because of the revolutions. And in Vienna he finally then was appointed professor at the university, and then put all of his energy that he had basically into building up this new institute at the University of Vienna. And he didn't have much energy left because he already had this lung disease which he was suffering from. But he built up this course in experimental physics, and this course was quite a very new way to teach, because it involved the students. The experiments were in part instructive, so the students were instructed in certain experiments, but then a large part of this course consisted of the students' own research projects. So they had to define their own research projects and then pursue them over the course of a couple of months. And this is not just my own thinking, but many historians of science actually think that this is where Mendel learned this rigorous quantitative approach to science that he later applied in his own breeding experiments. And Doppler was certainly not the only physicist who was influential there. As I said previously, Ettingshausen was actually a combinatorics specialist, so Mendel also got exposed to those ideas. I only want to say a few words about the Doppler effect, which you're probably all familiar with. This is really considered a milestone in the history of science. It basically, the Doppler effect describes the change in the wavelength of a sound or light source with respect to an observer. So if the source is moving, the wavelength will change relatively to the position of the observer. And this effect has found numerous applications through the sciences. So in medicine, for example, there's the Doppler sonograph for measuring the velocity of blood flow through the body. You're all familiar with GPS systems where the Doppler effect is applied, or in, of course, in radar measurements of all kinds. The Doppler effect has found application. So now this is Franz Unger, a botanist at the University of Vienna, who botanist and teacher of Mendel. Unger already came up a few times today, so I hope I'm complimenting on what the earlier speaker said. Unger was born in Styria, in a small village called Leutschach, and he first studied law in Graz, and then he went on to study medicine in Vienna. So interesting that he became a botanist after all, right? He did law and medicine. He completed his studies, and then he worked as a general practitioner in Stockerau, that's just north of Vienna, and then he worked as a court physician in Tyrol for a while. And then from there, from being a court physician, he was hired as a professor of botany. So that's how it went these days, to Graz, to the University of Graz in Styria. And then later he was hired, as I've said previously, by Thun Hohenstein. He was hired to become professor at the University of Vienna. And Unger had an incredibly broad research program ongoing. He was interested in cell biology, he was interested in plant anatomy, in plant physiology. He also studied biogeography and paleobotany, and he was an evolutionary theorist. So he did all of these things. And in his paleobiological work, he was actually rather quantitative. So he was not as mathematical as the physicists, but he was quantitative. He calculated occurrences of plants of certain taxonomic groups in different geological periods, and then he measured how those ratios changed over time with respect to other groups. And so he was able to deduce that the flora of the earliest geological period was dominated by algae, and then there was an age of ferns, and then horsetails, and then mosses, conifers, and finally only the flowering plants. So, of course, he did observational studies by studying fossils, but he had a quantitative approach to that as well. So this is actually a quote of the famous evolutionist Ernst Mayr, where he says that, from his book, The Growth of Biological Thought, where he says that among Darwin's many forerunners, few merit mention more than the Viennese botanist Franz Unger. So he is giving a lot of credit to the evolutionary ideas Franz Unger expressed. And he did that rather clearly in his writing, actually. He published a series of letters, the botanical letters, which he published in a newspaper, in the Wiener Zeitung, the Viennese news. And he wrote 17 of these letters about plant anatomy and plant physiology, but one of these letters deals with the evolutionary history of plants. So here I have a slide of showing you this 16th letter, which was called an attempt of a history to the plant world, or in the original German, das Pflanzenreich in seiner zeitlichen Erscheinung. And he was actually really very far in his evolutionary thinking. He has this concept of a common ancestor right there. So he writes, there is no doubt that this empirically reconstructed pathway can be theoretically pursued still further back until one finally gets back to an Urpflanze. So this translation here is by Ernst Mayr, and he left the term Urpflanze in the original German. And then he goes on, in fact, to an original cell, which has given rise to the entire vegetable world. So he's talking about the common ancestor here. He's talking about common origin. And this was before Darwin. So it's maybe not very surprising that Unger was a bit of a controversial character. There was a response to his botanical letters when he published these. There was a Catholic priest, his name was Sebastian Brunner, who reacted very provocatively to Unger's publications. He published his own response in the Wiener Kirchenzeitung, where he responded to Unger and ridiculed him. Basically, he said, these professors at these so-called Catholic universities, they deliver lectures on really beastly theories for years on end. So he was actually offended, but Unger himself was a believer. He was a Christian, so he didn't see any incompatibilities there at all, and he didn't really understand how his publications could be seen so provocatively. Basically the same scenario that later played out with Darwin. We had it in a miniature version already here in Vienna a few years earlier. So here is another pretty illustration. This is actually from Unger's botanical letters. He drew a horsetail forest from the Carboniferous. So he had an idea of what the extinct plant world looked like when he published his papers. This is from 1852. And one thing that I find quite interesting is that this controversy actually played out in Vienna right when Mendel got there as a student. So Unger published the last installment of his botanical letters in very close temporal proximity. I think there was only a week or two in between before Mendel got to Vienna. So Mendel must have totally been aware of this, and it was probably not easy to be a Catholic priest himself, then listen to a biologist teacher who is inspiring and who is convincing ideas, and then listen to this controversy that played out publicly in the Viennese media. This must have been interesting. So I would actually like to end with this quote by Mendel himself from his famous paper, Versuche über Pflanzenhybriden, where he writes, there's an essential difference in those hybrids that remain constant in their progeny and propagate like pure strains. So here we have the constant hybrids that Greg mentioned already earlier. This feature is of particular importance to the evolutionary history of plants because constant hybrids attain the status of new species. So this is evolutionary thinking. This is evolutionary thinking right there. This is thinking inspired by Unger's idea of common descent and emergence of new species out of existing species. This is basically the species problem we have here. Where do new species come from? So when Mendel started out to breed his peas, maybe he didn't see the full circumstances of what his results really meant, but he certainly, there were some evolutionary ideas that motivated him altogether. I should, for clarification, I should actually say that this term evolutionary history here, in the German original, this is Entwicklungsgeschichte, and both Unger and also Mendel, they used the term Entwicklung and Entwicklungsgeschichte to describe both development and evolution. The term evolution didn't exist in German yet. We didn't have the word Evolution. There was only Entwicklungsgeschichte. So these terms are make it hard to pin down whether the two of them were actually talking about development or evolution. But since he is talking about the status of new species, it's clear that it has an evolutionary spirit. And well, with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take on any questions if there are any.
Thank you. It was really very interesting talk. I really enjoyed that as I lived in Vienna also for a couple of years, so it was nice to see these old pictures. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. Yes, Professor Stense.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. I don't have a question, but I have a comment. It was not, I mean, you pointed out that before Darwin, there was a lot of thinking about the phenomenon of evolution. Darwin did not introduce the concept of evolution. That was, Unger was one of them. But what Darwin did was to introduce a mechanism that could explain, that we sort of now know, do explain evolution.
Yeah, there's no mention of natural selection in Unger's writing anywhere.
No, this is Darwin. This is Darwin.
Yeah. There's this idea of what they called it transmutation of species, so that species are variable and change into each other, and one species gives rise to another one, but yeah, natural selection is Darwin's concept, clearly.
And if I understand history right, Mendel understood that his finding would be important for understanding the theory of evolution, whereas Darwin did not understand that Mendel could help him. Agree?
Honestly, I don't know whether Mendel could grasp at all how far-reaching his findings were. I think he thought he had found out something that was a quantitative law that applied to plants, certain kinds of plants. But whether he knew that it applied to all organisms, I don't know.
I think he understood that he provided a mechanism that Darwin was not able to, and that troubled Darwin all his life since the publication of Origin and probably before.
Questions or comments? Yes, please.
Nice, thank you. Now, what strikes me is the choice of courses that Mendel really took. And first of all, that it was possible to put together your own syllabus. You know, today we are preoccupied with, you know, very well-defined course structures, and it's incredible. And then all these courses seem to be chosen with a perspective to actually do later what he wanted to do, because he chose, you know, experimental techniques, he chose mathematics, he chose botany, and so on. So do we know anything about that? Was that, you know, on purpose? But also, I mean, Doppler clearly was important in introducing him to, if you like, rigorous scientific experimentation. But don't you think that methodologically it was Ettinghausen's combinatorics which provided him with the methodology to later deal with the numbers he received from his experiments?
Yeah, that's quite possible. So apparently there was a copy of Ettinghausen's combinatorics book in Brno. I read somewhere. I think it was in the library of the monastery, or maybe it was in the some library close by. So this book was available for Mendel, but and he took courses with him. So I also think that the evolutionary ideas, or the inspiration for the evolutionary thinking, Unger was instrumental there, but the hard math skills, he got them from the physicists. And we discussed this previously. I mean, biology was maybe somewhat quantitative, but not at the level that physics was back then. So he must have learned that from the physicists. And also Doppler wasn't, he didn't have his full power anymore. He was really quite sick. So he also, this course, this demonstration in experimental physics was only, the students only got a little bit of instruction, and then they were supposed to do their own experiments. So this was not Doppler teaching 10 hours per week. Yeah.
Thank you. I have also said that I'm always very impressed by the universality of Gregor Johann Mendel, and we saw that he studied so many subjects, but when he did research, so he didn't study only genetics, but also meteorology and zoology, and have many other functions, even in the bank and so on. So I think nowadays we cannot imagine that the scientist had such could cover such a broad scope.
So many, such broad skills, such an impressive skill set. So maybe one thing to be mentioned, how did he pick those courses and how did he come up with his syllabus is this image that I showed you of the professors. This was the mathematisch-naturwissenschaftliche Klasse. These were all of them. This was the size. So the university was not the size that it is now. In physics, they took on 20 students. And so over the 2 years between 1952 and 1954, they had 40 students in physics. So the choice of courses was, of course, also somewhat limited.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Barbara. These are fantastic photos and pictures. I was wondering...
I spent a lot of time staring at old city maps because the street names changed in part. So it's actually hard to put, you know, the colorful dot on the map where it's supposed to be because the street has a different name now. But eventually I found it out.
So I was wondering if you found any correspondence between Unger and Mendel later, especially related to Mendel's work.
I don't think there is any, but maybe someone can correct me, but I don't think there is any. There was only one botanist, Nägeli, the Swiss botanist, Mendel communicated with him. He also sent him his papers and he wrote him letters with his results, but Nageli didn't grasp the meaning of. He also thought that he was a botanist with maybe not quite as much statistical training as Mendel, so he didn't understand that stochastic fluctuations are part of experimentation, and that, of course, sometimes the ratios are a little bit off and are not 3-to-1, but that doesn't take away from the universality of the law. So Nageli thought, yeah, it's interesting, but that's maybe I have a case here where things behave differently. But between Unger and Mendel, to my knowledge, I don't think there is any correspondence.